Why they're called sixes. Well, I'm back. I really wasn't going to come back and talk about this anymore, but so many of you wanted to hear more. More about my parents' ultimate end, or about different kinds of non-human entities. I guess a part of me was afraid that I was going to get in trouble. Still, here I am. Again. I guess I'm here to let you know exactly what I observed between the point that the sixes latched onto Mike and my mother. First, I wanted to clear a few things up that popped up in the comments. No, I'm not a six. That doesn't make any sense because being human is the only thing that sixes crave, but can't really have. They can't communicate, use computers, pretty much do any basic human thing. I don't think they even have the capacity to consider communication. I also haven't been a victim of a six. To be honest, I think it freaks them out that I can see them. So far, they've stayed away from me. Lastly, I didn't mean to sound so apathetic in my original entry. To be quite honest, I was horrified. But my internal defenses told me that this was the only way that I had a chance to get away from the beatings. The curiosity in me wanted to document what I was seeing. This won't be much like my previous entry. It will be a little less personal and a lot more documentary style, I guess you could say. I won't be going much into the haunting parts that the sixes create because it's mostly uninteresting. I want you to know how sixes affect human beings, not their surroundings. Okay, so here goes. This is month 1, or the first month. It's mostly normal, other than the fact that my parents became tired and very reclusive. The beating slowed down a lot to the point where it was only around the time where I would get too close or talk too much, which would annoy them both. There were times where they would both wake up screaming and constantly make comments on feeling as if they were being watched. I reassured them through gritted teeth that they weren't being watched as I stared into the eyes of that being that only began to feed on them. Month 2. My parents began sleeping unreasonably long, like 17 hours at a time. Sometimes they'd even wet the bed. I had to clean it. Absolutely inhuman, but normal for a subject of sixes. Attempting to wake them would be incredibly dangerous. But then again, it was kind of like that before. Only now it was amplified. At one point, I woke my mother up to ask her if I could borrow some bus fare to pay my way to a meeting with a family that was dealing with a supposed demonic haunting, which was actually just poltergeist activity caused by a 17-year-old boy with acne problems. She showed up turned her head slowly and began to scream the most deafening, inhuman scream imaginable. After that, she launched herself at me. Thankfully, at this stage, they're mostly drained of energy. She slapped me a few times before crawling slowly back to her bed, falling asleep as soon as she hit the pillow. The third month is the depressive stage, which is usually when we're most commonly called in to treat a case if we're not already called in by the first month. My parents had cut back the sleeping a few hours and just began sobbing about the absolute worst things almost all the time. They both began to self-harm as well, right in front of me. While this was the least harmful month for me, it was the worst to watch. There were several other points where I wanted to tell them, but I knew they would be angry. Additionally, they both claimed to see red eyes behind their shoulders, and once again, I reassured them that I saw nothing, and it made me feel worse. The fourth month, this is where things started to turn. They stopped sleeping almost entirely and talked almost constantly. I had never seen this face personally, so I had no idea what to expect. I was just sitting down on the couch when my mother sat down next to me and looked me in the eyes for the first time since I was little. But there wasn't love in her eyes like there had been at one point. I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was, but she started to speak. She spoke so fast that it took me a minute to make out what she had said. What she said was, "I never wanted you. Never once in my life have I ever wanted you. When you were a baby, I thought about smothering you with a pillow and claiming SIDS. The only thing you've ever been good at was being a freak." This broke off into a month of hell. One that I'll do my best to forget after this. My parents lost their filter entirely. They could have been making up things just to intentionally be hurtful, but it didn't seem like it. The fifth month, I had to be absent for a lot of it. They both became extremely violent to the point where I was almost killed. I had been brushing my teeth when Mike burst into the bathroom, and by this point, both of them were completely spastic almost all the time. But he grabbed me by the back of my hair and kicked me in the back of my legs until I was down on the floor. He then dragged me by my hair over the toilet and he attempted to drown me. I don't know what caused him to stop, but he got distracted before he could finish the job. That's around the time I decided that I I couldn't safely stick around. I couch surfed a few days until a friend with one of the gifts, Milana, let me stay with her indefinitely. I told her what was going on, and she agreed that we would wait it out, and keep an ear out. She could see what I see, but she could also read moods and basically the aura of a place. We talked about how to handle the end of it all. She was completely against going around during the final day, but I just had to. At least to see what happens when what happens to the sixes when they finish a job. Okay, the 6th month. We showed up outside the apartment complex, Milana and I, around 6 a.m. There were other inhuman entities outside the building. These were called Watchers. They are pretty much explained by their name. They like to watch people do bad things. Not just murder and suicide either. Molestation, abuse, sexual assault, etc. They fed off that until the deed is over. They look almost like normal people, but they're yellowed like an old photo. And they have these awful grins on their faces. The only parts of them that move are their eyes. I've never seen them on a job, but I've seen them out in public in various places, which worried me to the point where I had to go home. I can help with dead people, and I can even do a little about inhuman entities, but I can't make humans not do fucked up shit. It was around 9 a.m. that Milana became too overwhelmed by the awful feelings she was getting. So I told her that it was alright to go park down the block while I went inside to check on them. She protested, but only for a second. I think she knew how important this was for me. The Watcher's eyes followed me from the car to the building. As I exited the stairwell to the hallway of the floor my parents lived on, I heard an absolutely horrifying shriek. And I knew that it was happening. I bolted, fumbling to get my keys out of my bag. I undid the lock and swung the door open as fast as I could. The sixes were no longer on my parents' backs. No. I think that was the first thing I noticed. They were crawling around them in circles. Mike was on top of my mother, pinning both of her arms down with his knees. God, it was so bloody and I had seen some horrible things, but this kind of brutality was an entirely different chapter for me. I could tell that she was already gone, and the six that had been using her was only absorbing what was left. Mike turned to look at me with this horrible grin on his face, not unlike the ones I had seen surrounding me outside. It was worse. He had a knife in his hand, the one he had just used to kill my mother, and he put it to his throat and slit it. I stood there, just frozen, speechless, not really sure what to do. I had imagined what this day would be like, but I never thought it would be so brutal. Not like this. I guess a part of me assumed that they'd just hang themselves, but that would be the least violent, and not in their nature. The sixes circled around the bodies a few moments before I caught their eyes. They became startled and quickly crawled up the wall past me and out the door. I dropped to my knees and sat for what felt like an eternity before a cop dragged me away. One of my neighbors had called the police, I guess. I was brought down to the station, but all I could tell them was that my parents had been acting strangely for months. I was cleared to leave, and Milana took me back to her house, where I broke down and cried in front of a human being for the first time in what felt like years. I haven't worked a six job since then. I got emancipated on my 17th birthday. Dropped out of high school and moved into a small apartment across town. I quit doing jobs, but only for a short while. I needed the money, and nobody was going to hire me for normal work. Not with my reputation. People in the gifted community knew that I allowed it to happen. The few people that were close enough to know that my parents' retirements were understanding and even somewhat grateful. I was a walking documentation of how it all happens. Everyone else, they were afraid of me. I guess I've grown from the situation. We now know a lot more about sixes and know how to stop them before it's too late. There are a lot less cases now that escalate fully. Still, I have this awful fear in the back of my mind that watching my parents die will break my spirit. And eventually, there's going to be a six on my back one day. I'm even more afraid of being condemned to hell for what I did. Where I know my parents are going to be there, waiting for me.